My name is Chelsea Thompto. I am an assistant professor of digital media art in the Department of Art and Art History, and my focus is on creative code. My research really exists at the intersection of art, technology, and trans studies. I got into this research kind of late in the game, actually. It wasn't until I got into graduate school that I really realized that all of these pieces could actually work together. So I've been interested in art since I can remember. My parents will say that I told them I wanted to be an artist by the time I was age 4. And then later in my high school and then early college career in my undergraduate, I came out as a trans woman, and that had a huge impact on the way that I existed socially in the university and in public. And as an artist, one of the best ways to respond to such monumental change is to make work about it. And so at that time in my early 20s, that's when my work really started to focus on my experience of being a trans woman and what it was like to be a trans person in the United States more broadly. And then once I got to graduate school, I had some really great mentors who allowed me to really imagine what it would be like to connect technology to the work I was making. And so I had always had an interest in computers. It was sort of a tangential thing that I'd been interested in alongside with making art, but I didn't really know that the two things could interact. And so once I started getting more examples and more guidance on how those things could work together, I was able to start to carve out a space to think about how technology impacts trans people and how technology can be used in art. And so in bringing all these things together, largely what I focus on now is the ways in which different systems, both explicitly technological, like artificial intelligence and facial recognition, but also bureaucratic, like the ways in which we manage things like birth certificates and those sorts of things, how those systems affect and impact trans people, especially when trans people and our bodies are often non-static, much like the image behind me of the Mississippi River. We're engaged in these systems that expect us to be static, expect our gender identity, our names, those sorts of things to stay constant over time when they don't necessarily do so. A lot of the work that I'm doing is to make really explicit and in some ways make the viewer feel a visceral sort of reaction to the ways in which trans people are made to feel like we don't fit in a certain system. So a lot of what I'm focused on and what I'm interested in terms of communicating this work is to really highlight the ways that these systems, which can seem really innocuous, they can seem very passive, how they can actually commit violences against people. And yeah, I think that, you know, because I work with technology, there is a lot of political tension in that space, right? Because you have this space where a lot of money is being poured into an economic sector, and a lot of technology is being implemented, new technologies are being implemented into governance, into policing, in a bunch of ways that we don't fully understand. And so one of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about my work is how can we hold larger companies and the stakeholders in these larger spaces of AI and facial recognition to account, right? How can we get the everyday citizen, your everyday art viewer, to have maybe a more critical thought process around artificial intelligence, around facial recognition, around the ways in which surveillance happens in technology. And so the way that this ends up happening in my work is often explicitly about trans bodies, but really the work that I do, I try to gesture towards larger structures in general. One of the ways that I like to talk about this with my students is that the act of you engaging in that system can fundamentally be a change to that system, right? The ways that artists use technological systems are fundamentally different than the way engineers do or the way that a computer scientist does. And so a lot of that comes from the process of being an artist, which for me generally means that I make things and I ask questions. And I do that over and over again and encourage others to do the same thing. So One of the ways that that's playing out in my work right now is through the development of a website where people will be able to actually explore facial recognition in real time and see how it works or how it doesn't work, how it reads them or fails to read them, and then allows people to start to think about the ways in which their particular communities might be impacted by these systems failing to read them for who they are. But a lot of what I'm really interested in is pointing out, right, these different systemic failures, but then in that failure, there's also opportunity, and that space where something isn't quite working or fails to comprehend isn't always a bad thing, and it actually might be a space where a student can come in or a viewer can come in and find opportunity to make something new, to fix a problem, or to disrupt it altogether and say, this is why this shouldn't exist. Yeah, I think that one of the spaces with art that is so exciting to me is that there is not necessarily so much a drive to make something that is explicitly productive or marketable in the sense that it has to be an app that 1 million people use on a day-to-day basis and they get venture capital and all of these things, right? That art can kind of opt out of that space, and that artists and art venues inherently are more interested in a slower conversation. They're more interested in a critical conversation that doesn't necessarily have to end up being something that is quote unquote productive. And so the space and the opportunity within art that maybe isn't as available to some other spaces is that the real core is that you're asking your viewer to come along on this interrogation with you, right? You're asking the viewer to sort of suspend disbelief. And this can lead to, different artists who like to use this space to imagine new futures or imagine alternative futures or alternative histories, or to take a certain technology that currently exists and may be causing harm and use it to do something else, use it to actually create a more entertaining or more compassionate system from a system that isn't inherently that way. And in all of that is packaged by the fact that, again, as artists, that is the point. The point isn't that we are trying to necessarily produce a thing for a boss, but rather we're looking for opportunities to explore these the boundaries and really push against the expectations that people have. The courses that I teach here are in digital media art. I am relatively new, so I don't know, all the courses that may become part of my purview in the years to come. I'm excited to branch out and try some new things. But largely what I'm teaching is creative code. So what that means is art classes wherein the main goal is that you're learning something about coding while also making art projects. And then in addition to that, I'll be teaching in future semesters some seminars which focus more explicitly and more heavily on theory around digital media art. For the spring semester, which I'm about to start, I'm teaching an introduction to creative coding class and a web development class. The web development class basically is an extension of that introduction class, but only focused on creative coding for the web. And so what this ends up looking like really in the moment is figuring out how to show students the basic core things that they need to know to actually make code function, which can be quite a feat and is complicated in a lot of different ways, depending on what programming language you're using, what prior experience students have, but then also to try to show them at each one of these steps how artists are actually intervening in those technologies and making things in that space. So for this spring semester, in my digital media art class, what's the number? In my Art 101 class, that course is going to predominantly focus on creating interactive artworks using JavaScript, using a process called P5JS, which is this open source platform that allows artists to make and share interactive web-based works really, really easily. And so the advantages of this are that students can go online and find a lot of resources. They get to, see other artists who are working in that space, and it's very visual first. So it's very much about creating something that has a visuality right away, which isn't always the case with code. So a lot of times when we think about code, you think about all the text and punctuation scrolling down a screen, and that is actually a lot of what the classes are, which can be a little bit difficult when you're teaching an art course, because that's not the most visually engaging thing to talk about. And so what P5JS allows me to do is it allows me to have the students have a very visual experience very early on in the process. With my Art 109 class, that class is really specifically about how do you make websites, and what does it mean for an artist to make a website or to be a web developer? So how can an artist intervene in that space to make something interesting? One of the really exciting things that I get to do with that class is that I'm currently a artist in residence, digitally artist in residence, virtual one, at an arts organization that's actually based in Spokane, Washington. And through that, I do live streams every other week to talk about the development of an interactive artwork that I'm currently making, which involves using JavaScript to create live facial recognition interactive artworks online. And so because I have this opportunity within my research, I'm able to pull that in and actually show those live streams to my students, show that work to my students. And then one of the really important things I think in all art, but specifically can be very useful in digital media art, is to show students my own work in progress. So show them the mess in the middle, the parts that aren't totally finished, the parts that I wouldn't really want to show in an art gallery or to a curator. But those moments really, really provide a really rich experience for students to see that it doesn't have to be perfect and completely clean from beginning to end. And it also allows them to sort of pick apart what I'm doing and ask questions about a project that's living, right? And so it's not just me trying to respond to their questions of, how did that artist do that thing, which I can definitely respond to, but it's a little more engaging if it's, how did you do that thing, right? And so by showing that in progress work, the students also then get to know that I'm a real artist who makes things and who struggles through making things sometimes, and that it's not always the most glamorous process. And so what I love about that is that it builds a sense of community, and it lets them know that being a learner of code and learning new things about technology doesn't stop when they leave the class or when they leave the university. And in fact, a lot of the things that they're going to end up doing in their career, whatever their career may be, are going to be learned during that process. And so I really love being able to bring that into the fold and allow them a chance to see things as they're happening. In general, when I'm thinking about digital media art and what the courses are for and what we're doing there, we have to think about it in the context of the university as a whole, and why would someone get a digital media art degree instead of perhaps getting a computer science degree, right? Like, or why are they getting a digital media art degree instead of a pictorial art degree? And so it really becomes about honing in on how artists can intervene in the digital space to make something new happen, and what can an artistic way of thinking provide that perhaps computer scientists could benefit from, right? And we see this all the time where artists will engage with technology, they'll engage with something that has been developed by engineers and scientists, and they'll fundamentally change the context that people are thinking about that technology within, right? So in so doing, what that really states is that art has a power. It really does have a power to impact the way people see, understand, and think through their choices with technology. And so myself and a lot of the other digital media art faculty, we're thinking about these things when we're thinking about our classes. It's not just, how do I teach you how to design a website, but why should you learn how to design a website, and what does it mean for there to be a website at all? And what is that whole space? One of the first things that I'm going to be doing with my students is to talk about the idea of emulation. So when we're thinking about a website, oftentimes if you're going to say the New York Times, right, they're trying to emulate your experience of a real physical newspaper. that's what their goal is. They're trying to make it so that when you are on that website, it's like you're holding the New York Times in your hand in one way or the other. You can tell that by the font they use. You can tell that by the format that they're going for. The same way that Facebook or Twitter is trying to be this town square, right? They're trying to emulate this public forum, this public space. And so what happens when we think about that, that idea of emulating something or mimicking something, and what are websites trying to mimic? And then how can you start to think about websites differently if every time you go to a website, you're thinking about what is this website trying to mimic that exists in the real world? Or what exists in the real world that might be a mirror for this website? And that is one of the ways that in both my Art 101 and my Art 109, which is the web development class, one of the ways that I'm going to be engaging them and thinking about these other ways of engaging subjects of design and code, so that we're not just talking about, here's where you need to put your semicolon and your parentheses, and this is how the code works. But when you build all of that up, what is it that people are going to end up seeing, and what are they experiencing, and how can we then maybe take the expectations people have of code, of websites, and do something interesting and new with it. One thing that a mentor talked to me about was really this very simple thing that she said to me when I first got to graduate school, was that her main goal was to try not to reproduce the harm that her faculty had done to her when she was in school. And it's such a difficult thing to talk about, but it is very true that a lot of the times for faculty members, we've gotten to where we are because we were able to persevere through systems meant to sort of weed people out in these different ways. And oftentimes what that ends up causing is us to think that part of being in education, part of succeeding in education is struggling through a certain amount of pain or struggle in order to get to the other side. And I think that pushing back against that is one really simple way to check yourself in a moment, to be like, am I doing this because it's actually helping this student learn the content or get where they need to be? Or am I doing this because that is how it was done to me? And that's the way that I think people should be learning or experiencing this space. And that was just hearing that from an advisor was really, really helpful, both as at the time a grad student and now as a faculty member myself, as a way to check in and to really start to challenge and be self-reflective in my own understanding of what does it mean to be a student, or what does it mean to successfully achieve in this class? What are the conventions within my own discipline that don't actually fundamentally help promote mastery in my field, right? So what is it that I'm doing in my classroom because I think that's what should be done, and not because it's actually the thing that is going to impact students' success in the best way. And a really explicit example of that is that in art, we have a convention where we critique each other's work. And this is usually done by a person showing their work, and then everyone else in the class engaging in a conversation. And this can be a really beautiful, lovely space to talk about work and can be really super productive. However, it takes a lot of scaffolding for students to get there. And so it took me a little time teaching to understand that, an art class can be an art class without that core feature built in right away. And that, in fact, other forms of critique, other forms of discussion can be more productive. So offering students the ability to engage with their peers through writing, if they're more comfortable with writing, through asynchronous response. And this is even in in-person classes where I've had students do audio recordings of their response to other people's work, so that they didn't have to talk to that person in real time, but that person still got the human connection of a voice talking to them about the work. And that kind of lowers that heightened sense of anxiety that can come with being on a stage in front of other people. And so, I think that over and over again, what teaching has taught me is that, if I'm doing it right, if I'm doing things the way that are going to make me feel good at the end of the semester, It's that I'm constantly checking in with myself about where students aren't succeeding, where they're not achieving. And instead of assuming that it's a deficit on the students' front, instead thinking about the structure of the class and the trends within the class and how I might be able to address the ways in which I'm actually bringing up materials. One way in my own teaching that has been super helpful in terms of technical processes is I provide some sort of demo. If we're in person, that's often live in the classroom or a recorded session. But then I also look for other people who are giving a demo on the same thing through a YouTube video, through a book, through a podcast, through other methodologies, and give that as supplemental materials. Not because they necessarily say it better, but because sometimes people learn better based on a different person's way of structuring that same content, right? And so not feeling like I need to be the sole author of the information that they're learning, but rather to offer them a wide array of different materials to engage with that subject with. Because again, at the end of the day, it really comes down to what can I do to reduce the barriers, the artificial barriers, right? So when I'm thinking about this in terms of my Canvas design, when I'm thinking about Canvas design, I'm thinking about, if I have a quiz, why does that quiz have time? Why is there a time limit on it? And if there is a time limit on it, what is it that time limit is actually doing to prove to me that a student has learned something? And if I'm concerned about cheating or about open book or something like that, that maybe the concern needs to be shifted towards the quality of the questions such that what they're being asked to do is actually more reflective of a synthesis of knowledge, right? So, how can I author a question wherein I'm not worried about someone's response being plagiarized or whether or not they're quote unquote cheating, and instead thinking about ways of assessing student learning that, inherently resist that sort of yes, no, right, wrong sort of binary. This is, of course, I think maybe a little bit easier in the humanities, but in general, I have found that project-based or exercise-based practices can be a great way to get students hands-on and allow them to learn material without that sort of anxiety of checking a box or getting something done in a particular period of time. Another teaching tip, I think the last one that I will probably say is that, when I'm teaching, I'm often nervous about the way that I sound or the way that my body exists in space. This is, I think, true whether or not I'm in person or doing something virtually. And I often, really think about how that emotional nervousness can really impact the way that I'm teaching. So, how is it that me being anxious about being on or being performing, like how can that maybe change the way that I'm responding to students, and how can I check in with myself? And then also to think about the fact that students themselves are all having those same different embodied experience throughout the classroom. And so like, what are the simple ways that I can actually make the classroom a more comfortable, welcoming space so that everyone can feel like they are allowed to be themselves in that space, and that it doesn't have to be this sort of performative space. So for me, I know that not all classrooms can do this, but it can be as simple as, not being so strict about food if your building and if your facilities allow it, not being strict about coffee or water, allowing people time to get up and stretch and have breaks, and let everyone know that they're adults, and that as adults, you trust them to make the decisions they need to make for their body, and that you're not going to be monitoring them in those spaces. And I think that creating a space that has those sorts of expectations, a more welcoming space, allows for actually some more of the critical, challenging work to happen, because it allows everyone to feel like they're on the same page, that they're all being treated as equals in the classroom. And it can really, especially in an art space where we're asking students to engage in some pretty heavy topics, allow us to be able to actually have those discussions in ways that are productive for everybody. Sidebar, I don't know how this is, you know, going to live in terms of the pandemic, but I will say that, you know, COVID times and working from home has been a challenge, a unique challenge in terms of work-life balance. Something super simple that seems maybe kind of silly, but that I'm doing right now is getting a standing desk has been incredible. It has allowed me to like really change bodily how I'm engaging with coming to work and leaving work. Part of this is also a challenge because the space that I work in is also the space that my spouse works in. And it's also the space where, you know, if I'm using the computer for any non-work thing, I'm in the same spot. So, you know, normally I try to carve out a space where that's the space where I do things for work. And then when I'm not working, I don't, but I can't do that right now. So instead, I stand at my desk when it's work time. And then when it's not work time, I change the desk back to a sitting desk. And I think that even those artificial barriers can be really, really helpful. Being that I'm in the first year of a tenure track position and that it's my first time being on the tenure track, there are a lot of things about service and research and teaching and how all of those things come together that I didn't know how it was all going to work and how it all could get pieced together. And of course, I would not say that I'm a complete expert at it. But one thing that I have done is that I've started to block out time for myself in my Google Calendar, even though that time isn't really you know, marked out with an actual meeting or maybe even with a task, but even just blocks that say service or blocks that say research or blocks that say teaching prep or blocks that say grading. And those don't always get followed, right? Like a lot of times you have to throw a meeting into where the research was, but having them on the schedule has really allowed me to like be mindful of, okay, well, if I have to do this time, which is totally fine, where else am I going to find time to do that thing? How am I going to find time to do that? Another thing that I have done in terms of especially the research, which is you know, incredibly challenging in this moment as an artist who generally relies on having some sort of studio space and is working totally from home, is to find opportunities, opportunities that maybe aren't, you know, the big grant that is multiple pages and tons of work, but smaller opportunities that can help you structure time and structure deadlines to get smaller portions of a project done. So the project that I mentioned earlier that has to do with facial recognition and creating this online interactive artwork, it's a very large project, and it's a project that I imagine taking the better part of 2 years at least to really complete. But by breaking it down into smaller pieces, I was able to apply to an artist residency based off of a small portion of what that larger project is going to be, which allows me now to have the ability to structure time every week, to work towards my research goals, and to have this external feedback that allows me to be a little bit more productive and to get outside my own head as I'm doing that work. And then, you know, this is the first time that I've lived this close to the ocean. I'm from the Midwest, which, you know, I never, if a young me, a high school me had said that someday I would live in driving distance to the ocean, I don't think I would have really believed it. And so one thing that my wife and I have been doing is that, you know, we try to carve out a day every week where we go do something. With COVID, a lot of what that has been is going to different beaches and hiking in the mountains, but it's something that, you know, it's simple. It doesn't take a lot of time or energy to prepare, and it's COVID safe. But getting out into nature and being able to connect with the landscape in this new place that I'm in has been hugely grounding, and that really helps. And then I guess the other thing about work-life balance that I will say is that you know, I try to turn off my email from a certain time of day, whatever that ends up being. You know, I say I'm not going to answer any work emails or any you know, emails related to my art practice or anything after X period of time, or I'm going to chunk out this time to not look at my notifications on whatever different applications. And I think that doing that kind of allows you to reset, especially for the parts of my practice which involve a lot of reading and those sorts of things. It's important, I think, to carve out times that are distraction-free, screen-free when possible, to get some of that other work and thinking done.